I'm Daisy Calloway, 49, and I spent 30 years in the United States Coast Guard, going over the rail of smuggling boats in the dark long before anyone thought to write my name at the top of a page. For most of those years, I let strangers decide I was no one, a contractor, a spouse, a lost civilian in the wrong line, and I never bothered to correct them. But when a Navy SEAL cornered me in a military passenger terminal and told me to go wait with the families, not knowing he was flying to my operation, I made a choice about what I would and would not prove. Have you ever been dismissed by someone who had no idea who they were talking to? If so, tell me your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I get into what happened, let me know where you're tuning in from. And if you've ever had to stand quietly in your own worth after being written off, hit that like button and subscribe. People picture the Coast Guard as a rescue helicopter and a friendly wave from a white boat. They do not picture a 20-year-old woman going over the rail of a stranger's vessel at 2 a.m, 1,000 miles from anything solid to find out what is hidden under the deck plates. But that is where I learned who I was, and it is a lesson that took me almost 30 years to stop having to prove. It was the Eastern Pacific, 1996. I was a petty officer 3rd class on a cutter's boarding team, and the swell that night was running higher than the small boat we were supposed to launch. The sea was black and the sky was blacker, and somewhere out in that dark was a fishing vessel that had been riding too low in the water for what its papers claimed to be carrying. My job, and the job of the 4 people crammed into that little boat with me, was to climb aboard a boat full of men we did not know, in the middle of the ocean, and ask politely to look around. I remember the climb more than anything. The way the hull of the other vessel rose and fell like the flank of an animal breathing. The way you had to time the jump for the top of the swell, because if you timed it wrong, the 2 boats came together and you were in the water between them, which was the worst place a person could be. I timed it right. I got a hand on the rail, and then a boot, and then I was over, and my heart was going so hard I could feel it in my teeth. There were no cameras, there were no reporters, there was no parade waiting for us back at the pier. There was just the work and the water and the men on that deck deciding in real time whether they were going to cooperate. They cooperated. Under the deck plates, wrapped in plastic and packed like cordwood, was more product than I had ever seen in one place. We did our job, we documented, we detained, we handed the case up the chain, and we went back out and did it again the next night. And the night after that. That was the rhythm of my early years. Long patrols, cold coffee, boardings that would have made a movie audience gasp, followed by paperwork that would have made them fall asleep. What people do not understand about that kind of work is how much of it is patience. You spend weeks on the water for a single hour that matters. You stand watches in the dark and you scan an empty horizon, and you learn the difference between a fishing boat riding heavy because it has a good catch, and a fishing boat riding heavy because it has something to hide. You learn to read a wake, a hull, the way a crew moves when they see you coming. The boardings themselves were the sharp end, but the sharp end was a small fraction of the whole. The rest was the discipline of doing an unglamorous thing correctly for a very long time in conditions that made cutting corners tempting and never cutting them. Master Chief Marsh used to say that the sea rewards patience and punishes shortcuts, and that the smugglers were counting on the shortcuts, so we did not take them. We were slow and careful and relentless, and that was how we won. The man who taught me how to do all of it was Master Chief Odell Marsh. He was near the end of a very long career when I was near the start of mine, and he had a face like weathered rope and a voice he almost never raised. He did not need to raise it. When Master Chief Marsh corrected you, he did it quietly once, and you never made that particular mistake again, because you would rather have walked into the sea than disappoint him a second time. I made plenty of mistakes those first years. I rushed a search once and missed a compartment, and he did not yell. He just walked me back through it, step by step, until I understood not only what I had missed, but why I had missed it. And when I finally got it right, when I ran a clean, careful textbook boarding on a rolling deck in bad weather, he did not throw me a party either. He just nodded one time, and that nod was worth more to me than a medal. Master Chief Marsh was, in a way I did not appreciate until much later, the first person in my life who judged me entirely on what I could do rather than on what I appeared to be. I had grown up being told, in the thousand small ways a girl gets told these things, what I was likely to be good at and what I was not, and almost none of those predictions had included going over the rail of a smuggling vessel in the dark. Marsh did not care about any of that. He did not see a young woman who might not belong. He saw a petty officer who either searched a compartment correctly or did not, and his entire respect was available to me, in full, the moment I searched it correctly. There was something enormously freeing in that. For the first time, the only thing standing between me and being taken seriously was the quality of my own work, and the quality of my own work was the one thing I could actually control. I have chased that feeling my whole career. I have tried to build it, deck by deck, for every young person who ever served under me. Because I know what it did for me, to be measured by the work and nothing else, at an age when the rest of the world was still measuring me by everything else. He retired the year I commissioned, and I lost touch with him the way you lose touch with the people who shaped you, gradually and without meaning to, until one day you realize a great deal of time has passed. But I carried him with me into every room I ever walked into after that. And on the morning in the terminal, when a stranger decided in half a second that I was no one, it was Marsh's voice I heard, telling me not to argue, telling me to let the work speak, telling me that the only rank that travels is the one you cannot take off. I asked him once why he never seemed to care that people underestimated the Coast Guard. We were tied up alongside a Navy warship on a joint patrol, and one of their junior officers had made a comment at breakfast, loud enough for us to hear, about the Coast Guard being the junior varsity team. The kids who could not make the real cut. I was young and it made my face hot. Marsh just kept eating. Later on the deck, I asked him how he stood it. He looked out at the water for a while before he answered. "You want them to know who you are," he said. "Do the job so well they cannot pretend you were not there. That is the only rank that travels. Everything else stays home when the shooting starts." I did not fully understand him at 20. I understood him completely by 49. But it took a lifetime of small dismissals to teach me what that old man knew in his bones, and it took one loud stranger in a passenger terminal to show me exactly how right he had been. Because here is the truth about the work I chose. The Coast Guard is the service everyone forgets is a military service at all. We wear the uniform, we deploy, we carry weapons, and we take fire, and we bury our own, same as anyone. But we also pull families off sinking boats and check safety placards on fishing vessels, and because people see the rescue and not the rest, they decide the rest does not exist. For 30 years, strangers looked at me and saw a lifeguard with a badge. They did not see the deck plates, they did not see the dark water, they did not see the man who taught me that the only argument that never loses is the work itself. I gave that life everything. I gave it the years when other people were getting married and buying houses. I gave it holidays I spent on the water and birthdays I spent in a rack on a rolling ship. I gave it 2 relationships that could not survive the deployments and a lot of quiet nights, wondering if I had chosen right. I decided somewhere along the way that I had. The sea does not care what you think you are. It only cares what you can actually do. There was something clean about that. Something honest. On the water, the underestimating stopped because the water does not underestimate anyone. It just tests you, over and over, until you're either good enough or you are gone. I intended to be good enough. So I climbed, not for the rank, though the rank came. I climbed because I wanted to lead the teams I had come from, the boarding teams, the ones who went over the rail in the dark. I wanted to be the Odell Marsh for some frightened 20-year-old on a pitching deck at 2 a.m. I wanted to hand down the only lesson that had ever mattered to me. And to do that, I had to keep going. Up through the ranks, into rooms where fewer and fewer people looked like me, carrying with me the certainty that a name is just a name until the work makes it mean something. By the time I stood in that terminal at 49, I had made the work mean a great deal. I just had not written it on my shirt. And that, it turned out, was the whole story. I commissioned in 1999. It was not a small decision. I was a seasoned petty officer by then, respected on the boarding teams, comfortable in my own competence. Becoming an officer meant starting over in a sense, trading the certainty of the deck for the responsibility of the whole picture. But Master Chief Marsh, who was retiring that same year, told me the teams needed leaders who had actually been on the teams. So I went to officer candidate school and I pinned on the single gold bar of an ensign, and I began the long climb up the officer ranks with the salt of the enlisted years still in me. That salt never washed out, and I was glad of it. It meant I never forgot what the job felt like from the deck. It also meant I never developed the thin skin some officers grow, the kind that bruises at every slight. I had been underestimated as a young enlisted woman in a service everyone dismissed. By the time I was an officer, the dismissals were just weather to me. You do not argue with weather. You dress for it and you keep moving. But the weather was persistent. In 2007, as a lieutenant commander, I deployed with a law enforcement detachment aboard a United States Navy warship. It is a strange thing, being a guest on someone else's ship. The Navy crew was professional and mostly welcoming, but there was a current underneath. A sense from a few of them that the Coast Guard detachment was cargo, passengers, a box the Navy had to check because of some legal technicality they did not fully respect. The legal technicality, as it happened, was the entire reason we were there. A Navy warship can chase a smuggler across an ocean, but under the law, it often cannot be the entity that boards, searches, and makes an arrest in a law enforcement action. That authority belongs to the Coast Guard. So when we finally ran down a go-fast boat that had been taunting the task force for 2 days, it was my detachment, not the ship's crew, that had the legal power to do anything about it. My people went over the side, secured the vessel, found the contraband, and made the case. The Navy officers who had treated us like passengers watched a Coast Guard team do the one thing their entire multi-million-dollar warship could not lawfully do. Nobody said the words, junior varsity, after that. That go-fast had been the source of a good deal of frustration on the ship. For 2 days it had run rings around the task force, close enough to track but always just out of reach of anything the Navy could lawfully do to it, and the mood on the bridge had curdled into the specific irritation of powerful people who cannot use their power. I had watched it happen and said nothing because there was nothing to say. The law is the law, and the law had put the key to that particular door in my detachment's pocket, not theirs. When the moment finally came and the ship maneuvered us into position, my boarding officer, a soft-spoken second-class petty officer who had never once raised his voice on the whole deployment, went over the side into a pitching boat full of desperate men and brought it under control so cleanly that the whole thing was over before the ship's crew had finished gathering at the rail to watch. Afterward, one of the Navy lieutenants who had been coolest to us all crews sought me out and, to his credit, told me he had been wrong about my people. I told him he had not been wrong about my people. He had just never seen them work. I did not gloat. Marsh had trained that out of me. But I filed the moment away with all the others, another small proof that the work is the only argument that never loses. The proof I would come to lean on most, though, came in 2014. I was a commander by then, and the operation was an interagency counter-narcotics mission far to the south. The kind of joint effort where the lines between services blur because the mission is bigger than any one of them. We had received intelligence on a semi-submersible, one of those low, half-sunk vessels that smugglers build to slip beneath radar, carrying an enormous load north. The boarding was going to be dangerous, and it was going to be joint. A Coast Guard boarding team, mine, and a Navy Special Warfare element working the same target on the same night. That is when I first crossed paths with a young Navy operator named Ruben Castellano. He was a petty officer first class at the time, quiet, watchful, the kind of man who says little and misses nothing. I did not know his name would matter to me 11 years later. That night, he was just one of the shooters, and I was just the Coast Guard officer running the boarding. The semi-submersible was crewed by 4 men, and when we came alongside, they began to scuttle it. They opened the valves and let the sea in, trying to send the evidence, and themselves, to the bottom rather than be caught. It is a terrifying situation. A vessel deliberately sinking under you, armed men who have decided drowning is preferable to arrest, and a boarding team that has to make a decision in seconds. The easy thing, the thing that would have been legally defensible and tactically simple, was to back off and let it go down. I did not back off. I talked. I got a translator up on the radio and I talked those 4 men off a sinking boat without a single shot fired, promising them nothing except that they would live, which was more than the sea was promising them. We pulled all 4 out of the water. We recovered enough of the vessel to make the case. And Ruben Castellano, watching from a few meters away with his weapon up and his finger off the trigger because I had made the shooting unnecessary, apparently never forgot it. He told me years later what he had thought that night. I watched a Coast Guard officer talk 3 armed men off a sinking boat without firing a shot. He said, "I have never forgotten her face." At the time, I did not know he had thought anything at all. That is the nature of this work. You do the thing, and you do it well, and you have no idea who is watching or what they are carrying away. You just do the job so well they cannot pretend you were not there, and you trust the rest to sort itself out. But here's what I had learned to expect by 2014, and what I fully expected walking into that terminal in 2025. The higher I rose, the less anyone recognized what I was. When I was a young enlisted woman, at least the uniform announced me. As I got older and traveled more in civilian clothes and stopped wearing my rank on my chest, the assumptions multiplied. I was a spouse. I was a contractor. I was somebody's aide. I was a lost civilian who had wandered into the wrong line. I had stopped expecting to be recognized and started expecting to be underestimated, and I had decided a long time ago that I could live with that. It even had its uses. People tell you a great deal about themselves in the moments when they think you are no one. I just did not yet know how much one stranger was about to tell me about himself. The terminal was cold and bright and full of the particular tiredness of people who have been awake since before dawn, for a flight they did not choose the timing of. It was 2025, and I was 49 years old, and I was standing in a military passenger terminal in civilian travel clothes, holding a paper cup of bad coffee, waiting on a rotator flight to a forward staging base, along with about 120 other people, bound for the same operation. They did not know I was running it. I was the Joint Mission Commander for the surge we were all deploying to support, an interagency counter-narcotics push staged out of Joint Interagency Task Force South. Half the people in that terminal were flying to my operation, but a mission commander in a fleece jacket and travel boots reviewing notes on a tablet in a corner seat looks exactly like anyone else waiting on a delayed flight. I liked it that way. I had learned to do my thinking in the anonymity, to watch a room while the room ignored me. Near me sat a young Coast Guardsman from my own task element, a maritime enforcement specialist second class named Toby Quill. He was 24, and he had the specific nervous energy of a junior enlisted person who has just realized he is sitting 3 feet from a captain and does not know whether he is allowed to speak. I had told him twice he could relax. He was working on it. My aide, Lieutenant Noor Haddad, had stepped away to the counter to sort out a seat manifest question, so it was just Quill and me in the corner and the general churn of the terminal around us. Then the SEALs arrived. You could hear them before you could see them, that easy, loud confidence that comes off a tight team of men who are very good at a very hard thing and have never once doubted it. There were maybe 8 of them, and at the center, setting the tone, was a Special Warfare Operator Chief named Brett Kilgore. I did not know his name yet. I just knew the type. Broad, sure, 35 or so, the kind of operator who fills a doorway and knows it. The boarding lane for our flight formed right where I was sitting, and Kilgore wanted it clear. He scanned the area the way men like him scan a room, sorting everyone instantly into categories, and he landed on me. A woman, alone, civilian clothes, sitting in the way. And he made his decision about who I was in about half a second, which, as it turned out, was exactly the failure I would end up caring about most. He stepped in front of me, close, blocking my path to the counter, and looked down with a grin that had no meanness in it, just certainty, which is somehow worse. "This line's for operators, sweetheart," he said. "Coast Guard's not even real military. Go wait with the families." Behind him, a couple of his guys laughed, not cruelly, just the easy laugh of men agreeing with their chief. Their platoon commander, a Navy lieutenant named Cole Rutherford, stood a few feet back, and he heard every word, and he said nothing. He looked mildly uncomfortable, the way people look when they would rather not get involved, and he let it stand. That silence, I would decide later, was its own kind of answer. Toby Quill did not stay silent. The kid shot to his feet, his voice shaking with the effort of speaking up to a man twice his size and 1 rank his senior in the enlisted world. "Chief," he said, You don't know who that is." Kilgore did not even look at him. "Sit down, son," he said, still grinning at me. "The grown-ups are talking." I put a hand on Toby's arm, gently. I could feel him vibrating with the need to defend me, and I could also see exactly where that road went. So I quieted him, and I did not announce myself, because I had spent 30 years learning that the fastest way to lose an argument about who you are is to have it out loud. The moment you say the words, you have handed the other person the power to disbelieve them. I was not going to hand Brett Kilgore anything. "I'll wait," I said mildly, and then I did the only thing that mattered. I did not move. I stayed exactly where the manifest line actually formed, coffee in hand, and I let him think he had won. He turned back to his team, satisfied, and for about 90 seconds, the terminal belonged to him. Then the Air Force terminal representative on shift, a master sergeant with a clipboard, and the specific weariness of someone who runs these flights every day, walked up to call the manifest. She needed a hand, and Kilgore was the nearest man in uniform, standing tall and obvious at the front of his team. So she held out the printed passenger manifest to him. "Chief, do me a favor," she said. "Find your name, initial next to it, and pass it down." Kilgore took the clipboard with the easy authority of a man used to being handed things. He scanned down the list, looking for his own name, the way anyone would. And at the very top of that manifest, above every operator, above every name on that aircraft, printed in the plain block letters of an official document, was the line that made the whole terminal tilt on its axis. Callaway Daisy M. Captain, United States Coast Guard, Joint Mission Commander. I watched him read it. I watched his eyes go to the top line the way eyes always do, and I watched the grin come apart on his face, slowly, like something dissolving. He looked at the clipboard. He looked at me, sitting in my corner in my fleece jacket with my bad coffee. He looked back at the clipboard. And the color went out of his face the way it goes out of the sky at the end of the day, all at once, and from the top down. "Mission Commander," he said, and his voice had lost every bit of the easy certainty it had carried 30 seconds before. "Captain Callaway, that's you?" I looked up at him. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I just held his eyes for a moment and let the printed page do the work that no raised voice of mine ever could have. "That's me," I said. The terminal did not erupt. Nothing dramatic happened. No gasp, no applause, none of the things people imagine. What happened was quieter and far more total. It was the sound of about a dozen people within earshot, recalculating everything at once. The small shift of a room reorganizing itself around a fact it had gotten wrong, and it moved outward from that clipboard like a ripple on still water. The first person to move was Ruben Castellano. He was 11 years older than the night on the semi-submersible. A senior chief now, the senior enlisted man in Kilgore's own element, and he had been standing off to the side watching the whole thing with an expression I could not read. When Kilgore said my name, Castellano's face changed. Recognition arrived in it, sharp and certain, and he stepped forward out of the loose knot of seals and came toward me, and there was nothing casual in the way he moved. "Captain Callaway," he said. And then, to the stunned men behind him, without turning around, in a voice pitched to carry exactly as far as it needed to. "This is the officer who ran the boarding on the semi-sub off the isthmus in 14. She talked 4 armed men off a boat that was sinking under them. She is the reason my team came home that year." He let that sit for a second. "Chief," he said to Kilgore, "you want to close your mouth now." Kilgore closed his mouth. I stood up, unhurried, and I took the clipboard gently out of his hands, because it was mine to hold now in more ways than one. "Thank you, Senior Chief," I said to Castellano, and I meant it because he had not done that for show. He had done it because it was true, and because he was the kind of man who says the true thing in the room where it costs something. Before Kilgore could assemble whatever he was going to say next, another figure crossed the terminal toward me with purpose. Major Elias Bowen, the Air Force aircraft commander for the Rotator, a lean man in a flight suit with a folder under his arm, had been looking for the mission commander to give the pre-flight brief. He found her in the corner in a fleece jacket. "Captain Callaway," he said, coming to a stop in front of me. "Major Bowen, aircraft commander. I've got your weather and your load plan whenever you're ready, ma'am. We're looking at some chop over the water, but nothing that'll push us off schedule." It was the most ordinary thing in the world. A pilot briefing a mission commander before a flight. There was nothing cutting in it, no performance, no jab at anyone. That is exactly why it landed the way it did. Major Bowen was simply doing the correct and routine thing, addressing me by my rank because that was my rank, and the sheer normalcy of it was more devastating to Kilgore than any dressing down could have been. It told the terminal, without a single word aimed at him, that this was simply how things were, that the woman he had told to go wait with the families was the person the aircraft itself answered to. "Give me 2 minutes, Major," I said. "I'll come to you." He nodded, said, "Ma'am," and stepped back to wait, and the waiting was its own quiet sentence. Lieutenant Rutherford, the platoon commander who had watched Kilgore work and said nothing, chose that moment to find his voice. He came forward stiffly, his face tight, and he did the thing that officers do when they realize their silence has become their problem. "Captain, I want to apologize on behalf of my team," he said. "That was completely out of line, and it won't happen again. Chief Kilgore didn't know who you were." I looked at him for a moment. He wanted this closed. I could see it. He wanted a fast apology, accepted quickly so we could all move on, and pretend the last 5 minutes had not revealed anything real about his platoon. Fast absolution is cheap, and he was offering it because it was cheap and I did not have any to sell. He didn't know who I was, I agreed. "That's the part that doesn't bother me, Lieutenant." I set the clipboard down on the seat beside me. What bothers me is that he decided in half a second that a whole service full of people was beneath him. He didn't need to know my name to be wrong. He was wrong about 120 people in this terminal before he ever got to me. I let that settle. "I'm less interested in an apology than in whether your platoon can do the job when it counts. We'll find out soon enough." Rutherford did not have anything to say to that, which was the correct response, so I gave him a small nod to let him off the hook of standing there, and I turned toward Major Bowen and the weather brief. Because the weather brief was the actual job, and the actual job is always where my attention goes. Behind me, I could feel Kilgore still standing where the manifest had pinned him. I did not look back. I had learned over 30 years exactly how little satisfaction there is in a man's stricken face, and exactly how much there is in a job intact. The manifest had done what manifests do. It had told the truth on paper. But the truth had been true the whole time, in the dark water off the isthmus and on 100 rolling decks before that, whether or not anyone had read it at the top of a page. I walked over to Major Bowen, and we bent over the load plan together. And the operation, which was the only thing that had ever really mattered, went on. The flight south was 5 hours over open water, and for most of it, Brett Kilgore sat very still. I know because I watched him without seeming to. That is a skill you develop over a career, the ability to take the measure of a room while appearing to read a report. He sat 3 rows up and across the aisle, and he did not sleep, and he did not joke with his team, and he did not do any of the loud, easy things he had been doing in the terminal. He sat with the knowledge of what he had said and to whom, and he turned it over, and I let him. There is a use to that kind of silence. It does work that no lecture can. When we landed at the forward staging base and the aircraft disgorged its 120 tired, stiff passengers into the wet heat, I expected the machinery to start turning. And it did. By the time I had my task elements settled and had walked the operations center, the story had already run ahead of me the way these stories do. The Coast Guard captain, the SEAL chief told to go wait with the families, is the mission commander. It is a good story, and people repeat good stories. Lieutenant Rutherford found me first. He had clearly spent the flight deciding what to do, and he had arrived at the answer he thought I wanted. "Captain," he said, "I want you to know I'm prepared to pull Chief Kilgore from the operation and send him back. If you want him gone, he's gone. Just say the word." I had expected this, too. It is the reflex of a certain kind of officer to fix a problem by removing it, to make the embarrassing thing disappear so the unit's reputation stays clean. And I understood the impulse, but I had been thinking, on that long flight over the water, about what would actually be useful, as opposed to what would merely feel like justice. "No," I said. Rutherford blinked. "Ma'am?" "I don't want him sent home," I said. "Sending him home solves your problem, Lieutenant. Doesn't solve mine, and it doesn't solve his, and it definitely doesn't help the operation. I need every operator I brought. What I don't need is one who thinks the people on the other boat are beneath his attention. That gets people killed." I held his eyes. He stays, he works, and he answers to the standard, not to whatever picture of himself he walked into that terminal with. Is that clear? "Yes, ma'am. Rutherford said, and there was something in his face that might have been the beginning of respect, or might just have been relief that he was not going to have to write the paperwork on a relieved chief. I found Kilgore myself later, because some conversations you do not delegate. He was checking his kit in the staging tent, and he came to attention when he saw me, which he had not bothered to do in the terminal. "At ease, Chief," I said. "Sit down, this isn't a formation." He sat, warily. I sat across from him. Up close, without the audience and without the certainty, he looked younger and tireder than he had in the terminal. I did not draw it out. I have never seen the point of making a person squirm. "I'm not going to yell at you," I said. "You've spent 5 hours yelling at yourself, and that's more useful than anything I could add." He almost smiled at that and caught it. "I want to tell you what actually bothered me back there, because I don't think it's what you think. It was a stupid thing to say," he offered. "About the Coast Guard. I know that now." "It was," I agreed. "But I don't care that you said it to me, Chief. I've been hearing some version of it for 30 years. My skin is thick. Here's what I care about." I leaned forward. "You looked at a woman sitting alone in a terminal, and you decided in about half a second that you knew everything you needed to know about her. And you were wrong. Not because I turned out to be a captain. You were wrong the moment you decided a whole category of people wasn't worth your attention. That habit, the deciding fast that someone doesn't matter, is the exact habit that gets people killed on a boarding. Because the person you dismiss is sometimes the person holding the answer, or the weapon, or the wheel." He was quiet for a while. "I care about the people on the other boat," I said. "The crew we're going after out here. If you can decide in half a second that they don't count, you'll miss the thing that keeps you and your team alive. I'm not keeping you on this operation to punish you. I'm keeping you because I think you're a good operator who picked up a bad habit. And I'd rather fix the habit than lose the operator." "Understood, ma'am," he said, and for the first time it did not sound like a reflex. There was one more piece of external pressure I had to deal with. And it came the next day from a senior Navy officer at the staging base. A captain who outranked me by date of rank and was mortified that one of his community's chiefs had made his branch look bad in front of a joint task force. He came to me privately and offered, in the collegial tone of one senior officer, smoothing things for another, to quietly send Kilgore back stateside and make the whole thing go away. "No one needs a mess in the middle of an operation," he said. "I can have him on a flight tonight. Clean it up before it becomes a thing." I thanked him for the offer, and I declined it. "With respect," I said, "cleaning it up is exactly the wrong move. If we send him home, everyone learns that the way you handle a chief who disrespects the mission is to hide him. I'd rather everyone learn what actually happens, which is that he stays, and he does the work, and he finds out up close what he was dismissing. That's a lesson that spreads the right way. Sending him home just protects the image." The Navy captain did not love that answer. Senior officers rarely love being told that the tidy solution is the wrong one. But he accepted it, because it was mine to decide, and because he could not argue with the logic without arguing for the cover-up out loud. So Kilgore stayed, and I set the terms myself, which were simple and, I will admit, carried a certain poetry. For the first interdiction of the surge, Chief Brett Kilgore of the United States Navy SEALs would embed with the Coast Guard boarding team. He would not lead. He would watch and support and learn exactly what the words, "not real military," looked like when they were done in the dark on a heaving deck by the people he had dismissed. It cost him nothing but his certainty. It cost the operation nothing at all. And it bought me, potentially, a better man than the one who had blocked my path in the terminal. That is a trade I will make every single time. The first interdiction came 4 nights later, and it was everything the job is when the job is real. The intelligence pointed to a fishing vessel running a large load up the coast under cover of the fleet, blending in with the legitimate boats, counting on the sheer number of hulls on the water to hide one dirty one. Finding it was hard. Boarding it legally, safely, and in a way that would actually hold up when the case went to prosecution was harder. This is the part people never see when they picture the Coast Guard as a rescue service. The boarding is not the movie version, all breaching and shouting. It is a legal instrument executed under physical duress, a search that has to be perfect under conditions that make perfection nearly impossible. We put the boarding team over in the dark, in a rising sea, and I ran the operation from the tactical picture aboard the cutter, watching the feeds, listening to the team, making the calls. Toby Quill, the young Coast Guardsman Kilgore had told to sit down and let the grown-ups talk, was on that boarding team, and Brett Kilgore, one of the most capable special operators the United States produces, was embedded alongside him, watching. What Kilgore saw that night rearranged something in him. I know because he told me, later, in his own words. He saw the boarding team come over the rail of a moving vessel in the dark with the same timed precision I had learned at 20. He saw them establish control of a deck full of frightened, possibly armed men without firing a shot, using presence and authority and the specific weight of legal power. And then he saw the thing that only the Coast Guard could do, the thing that made the whole operation legal instead of an international incident. He watched the boarding officer assert the right to board, to search, to detain, under the actual authority of law, in a way that no SEAL element on Earth could have done, because that authority is not theirs to hold. There was a moment midway through when the vessel's master produced papers claiming a nationality that, if true, would have made the boarding illegal and handed the smugglers a clean escape. It was a trap, a legal one, and it was the kind of trap that a pure direct action force walks straight into, because their training is tactical, not jurisdictional. My boarding officer did not walk into it. She had the training, she made the right call, got the right authority, confirmed over the radio in real time, and kept the boarding legal, and therefore kept the entire case alive. Kilgore watched a Coast Guard petty officer defeat a legal ambush that would have cost him and his team the whole prize. I want to explain what that moment actually required because it is the part the world never sees. When the master handed over those papers, the boarding officer had perhaps 20 seconds to make a decision that would either hold up in a courtroom a year later or collapse the entire operation. She could not simply act on instinct the way a tactical operator does. She had to know the law cold, know the specific process for verifying or refuting a claim of nationality with the flag state, know how to keep control of a deck full of men while she did it, and know how to do all of it over a radio in a rising sea with the vessel's master watching her face for any sign of doubt. She showed none. She kept her voice level and her authority absolute. She got the verification she needed, and she disproved the claim, and the smuggler's one clever escape route closed like a door. It was not loud. It was not dramatic in the way a firefight is dramatic. It was a quiet, surgical piece of professional competence performed under enormous pressure, and it was worth more to the mission than any amount of firepower. Kilgore, who had 15 years of the loudest, sharpest training the country offers, told me afterward that he had not known that kind of skill existed, and that watching it had frightened him a little because he realized how much he did not know about the water he had been operating on his whole career. And he watched Toby Quill, the kid he had dismissed, work flawlessly. Under fire in the dark, on a pitching deck, Quill did his job the way I had done mine at his age, cleanly and without drama, the way you do it when someone taught you that the work is the only argument that never loses. Kilgore saw it. He saw the 24-year-old he had told to sit down handle a situation that would have overwhelmed a lesser man twice his age. We took the vessel, we recovered the load, we detained the crew, all of them alive, and we made a case that would actually stand up. No one on either team was hurt. It was, by every measure that matters, a clean and complete success, the kind of night that never makes the news precisely because nothing went wrong. I ran it from the cutter, calm and decisive, the same officer Ruben Castellano had described in the terminal, the one who had talked 4 men off a sinking boat in 14. I did not perform any of it for Kilgore's benefit. I was not thinking about Kilgore at all, in truth. I was thinking about my team, and the sea state, and the legal picture, and the 100 small decisions a mission commander makes in a night. But Kilgore was there, on the deck, watching, and he got to see, up close and with his own eyes, exactly what he had called the junior varsity team. A man who had stood in a bright terminal and called it not real military stood on a heaving deck at 3 a.m. and finally understood what he was looking at. And understanding, I have found, is the beginning of every real change there is. The recalibration, when it came, was not a grand apology, and I would not have trusted it if it had been. Kilgore came to me 2 days after the interdiction, not with a speech. Special operators are not, as a rule, men of speeches, and the ones who suddenly become eloquent when they need something are the ones you cannot trust. Kilgore did the harder, truer thing. He told me, specifically and without decoration, what he had gotten wrong and what he had seen. I watched your petty officer beat a flag trap on the deck that would have sunk our whole case. he said. "I didn't even know that trap existed. I've been doing this for 15 years, and I didn't know. That's not junior varsity. That's a thing I can't do." He paused. "I owe the kid an apology more than I owe you one, probably." I told him to sit down. "That's the first true thing you've said since the terminal," I told him. "Keep going." So he did. We talked, standing outside the operations center in the heat, longer than either of us expected to. And at some point I told him about Odell Marsh and the lesson that had shaped my whole career, because it was the thing he actually needed, and because Marsh had told it to me for exactly this kind of moment. "When I was young," I said, and it made my face hot every time somebody called the Coast Guard the junior varsity, "my Master Chief told me something I didn't understand for 20 years. He said, 'If you want them to know who you are, do the job so well they cannot pretend you were not there. That is the only rank that travels. Everything else stays home when the shooting starts.'" Kilgore thought about that. "Here's the part I want you to actually hear, Chief," I said. "I never needed you to know I was a captain. That's not the test. The test is whether you'd have treated the contractor or the wife or the lost civilian in that line the same way you'd treat me now that you know. Because that person, the one you decided didn't matter, deserved exactly what you're giving me right now. And you didn't give it to her. You gave it to the manifest." I let that land. The manifest shouldn't have been necessary. That's the whole lesson. If a person only becomes worth your respect once you read their rank off a page, you didn't respect people. You respected the page. He did not argue. He nodded, slowly, and I could see it going in, the way Marsh's lessons had gone into me. Not all at once, but for keeps. Ruben Castellano found me that same evening, and our conversation was a different kind. The easy, warm exchange of two professionals who have seen each other at their best across 11 years and 2 oceans. "You didn't remember me from 14, did you?" he said, smiling. Until I said it. "I remembered the boarding," I admitted. "I didn't remember your face. I'm sorry. There were a lot of faces that year." "That's all right, Captain," he said. "You weren't looking at me. You were looking at 4 men in the water who were about to drown. That's the whole reason I remembered you." He shook his head. "Some officers, when the plan goes bad, they get loud. You got quiet. You got a translator on the radio and you talked. I've thought about that 100 times since. It changed how I do this job." "That means more than you know," I told him. And it did, because that is the only kind of legacy this work offers. The quiet knowledge that somewhere out there a better operator is doing the job a little better because he watched you once, on a bad night, do it right. The change in Kilgore, when I watched for it over the remaining weeks of the surge, was behavioral and not verbal, which is the only kind that counts. He stopped filling doorways. He started, without being told, treating the Coast Guard personnel as the peers they were. He asked Quill to walk him through the legal side of boardings, actually asked a 15-year SEAL chief taking instruction from a 24-year-old Coast Guardsman, and he did it without a trace of the performance that so often passes for humility. He just wanted to know the thing he had not known, from the person who knew it. Respect, the real kind, cannot be demanded. It can only be earned, deck by deck, in the dark, over time. Kilgore had demanded it his whole career, and mostly gotten it because of how he looked and what he could do. Out here, he had to earn a different kind, from people he had dismissed, and to his credit, he did the work. By the end, the platoon that had laughed in the terminal treated my task element like the professionals we were. Not because I had ordered it, but because their chief had changed, and a platoon follows its chief. The surge wound down the way real operations end, without a ceremony. There was no parade, no moment where everyone clapped. There was just a series of successful interdictions, a significant amount of product kept off the streets, a number of smuggling crews detained and alive, and, gradually, the machinery of a joint task force disassembling itself and sending its pieces home. The Navy element went one way. The Air Force crews went another. My Coast Guard task element began the long process of packing up and rotating back. That is what success looks like out here. Looks like everyone going home in one piece, quietly having done the thing they came to do. Before Toby Quill left, he came to find me, and he had grown across those weeks in the way young people do when they get thrown into deep water and discover they can swim. He was not the starstruck kid from the terminal anymore. He had beaten a legal ambush on a heaving deck and handled himself under fire, and he carried himself like someone who knew it now. "Captain," he said, "can I ask you something?" "Of course, Toby." "In the terminal, when that chief was talking to you like that," he hesitated, "how do you not let it get to you? How do you just sit there and take it, when you could have ended his whole career with one sentence?" I had been waiting 30 years to close this particular loop, though I had not known it until that moment. I told him what Odell Marsh had told me on a Navy warship's deck when I was younger than Toby was now. "You do the job so well they cannot pretend you were not there," I said. "That's the only rank that travels. The sentence that ends his career, the announcement, the pulling out of the ID, all of that is you asking his permission to matter. And you don't need his permission. You never did. The work already made you matter, long before he walked into that terminal. He just hadn't read it yet." I smiled at him. "Do the work, Toby. Do it so well they can't pretend. Then it doesn't matter what anyone says in a terminal. It's just weather." He turned that over, the way I had turned it over at his age, and I could see him filing it away where it would keep. That is how the only lesson that ever mattered to me gets handed down. Not in a classroom, on a deck, or in a staging tent, from someone who learned it the same way. Kilgore did one more thing before he left, and he did not know I saw it, which is the only reason it counts. I was crossing the staging area at dusk, and I came around the corner of a supply tent, and there was Kilgore, and there was a young Coast Guard seaman, a kid even younger than Quill, struggling to move a pallet of gear alone. And Kilgore, a SEAL chief with nothing to prove to a Coast Guard seaman and no audience to prove it to, stopped and put his shoulder into the work and helped the kid move the pallet. He did not make a thing of it. He did not know a captain was watching. He just treated a junior Coast Guardsman like a person worth helping when there was absolutely no manifest to make him do it. That was the proof, not the apology, not the words at the operations center. That, the small correct thing done when no one was watching and no page said he had to, was how I knew the change was real. A man treats the people he thinks are no one exactly as well as his character actually is. Kilgore, when he thought no one was looking, had become a better man than the one in the terminal. That is the only measure I trust. I flew home a week later, and I flew home the way I had flown out. In civilian clothes, in an anonymous line, one tired traveler among many. At the terminal on the way home, in the same fleece jacket, waiting on the same kind of rotator, a young airman glanced at me, sorted me instantly into some category, a contractor probably, or somebody's wife, and looked away, uninterested. A stranger deciding in half a second that I was no one. This time it made me smile. Because I knew something now that I had only half known before. I knew that the smile was the whole victory. Not Kilgore's stricken face in the terminal. Not the manifest. The victory was that a stranger could look at me and see no one, and it did not touch me at all, because I no longer needed him to see anything. Years earlier, that same glance would have cost me something. I would have felt the old heat in my face, the reflex to correct the record, to sit up straighter, to find some small way to signal that I was not what he assumed. I would have carried it onto the plane and turned it over for an hour. Now it slid off me like water off a hull. The young airman went back to his phone, having filed me away as nobody, and I went back to my coffee, and the transaction was complete, and it had taken nothing from me at all. That, I realized, was what 30 years had actually bought me. Not the rank, not the record. The freedom to be underestimated by a stranger and feel nothing but a small, private amusement because the stranger's opinion had finally, completely, stopped being any of my business. I stood in that ordinary line carrying a record that no one around me would ever read. 30 years of dark water and rolling decks and men talked off sinking boats, and I was completely, unshakably fine with the fact that they would never know. The recognition had come in the terminal, in the form of a printed page. But I understood, standing in that line on the way home, that the recognition had never been the point. It was just the paperwork catching up to something that had been true all along. Home was quiet, and the quiet was the reward. There's a particular kind of rest that comes after a job done right, and it is not the same as ordinary sleep. It is the rest of a mind that has nothing left undone. I sat in my own kitchen with a real cup of coffee, good coffee, not the terminal sludge, and I watched the light come up through the window, and I did not have to be anywhere or decide anything or command anyone. I took a long walk. I slept without the phone next to my head. The small joys came back, the way they do when you have earned the right to feel them, laughter, ease, the feeling of a life that is open in front of you rather than clenched around the next mission. And I thought about the whole arc of it, the terminal, the manifest, Kilgore, the long flight, the interdictions, the young airman on the way home who had decided I was no one and been so completely, comfortably wrong. Here's what I finally understood, sitting in my kitchen with the light coming up. The manifest did not change who I was. It only changed what one stranger was able to pretend. My name at the top of that page had been true before Brett Kilgore ever read it, true in the dark water off the Isthmus in 14, true on a rolling deck in 96 when I was 20 years old and going over the rail with my heart in my teeth, true through 30 years of work no one clapped for. The page did not make it true. The page just made it undeniable to a man who had wanted to deny it. And the difference between those two things, between being true and being undeniable, is the whole difference between who you are and who other people are willing to admit you are. You only control the first one. A message came a few days after I got home from Ruben Castellano. It was short, the way messages from men like him always are. It said that his platoon had gotten home safe, that his chief was a changed man, and that he wanted me to know that the people who mattered had known who I was the whole time. He did not need to say the rest. The rest was understood between us, two professionals who had seen each other on bad nights and done the job right. I sat with that message for a long time. There is a phrase in it that I keep coming back to. The people who mattered had known who I was the whole time, because that is the quiet truth underneath the whole story, the one the manifest almost let me forget in the terminal. Recognition from the wrong people is worth nothing, and I had spent a foolish young decade chasing it before Marsh cured me of the habit. What is worth everything is the recognition of the people who have seen you work, who have stood next to you on a bad night and watched you do the hard thing right. Ruben Castellano's respect was worth 1,000 of Brett Kilgore's initial contempt, because Castellano had earned the right to give it by being there. And the beautiful thing, the thing I understood fully only in my own kitchen with the light coming up, is that you cannot control who those people will be, or whether they will ever say anything, or whether the world will ever catch up to what they already know about you. You can only be the kind of person they would recognize. The rest is out of your hands, and learning that it is out of your hands is the closest thing to peace this work has ever given me. The people who mattered always knew. That is the thing I want to leave you with. Whoever you are, wherever you are watching this from, if you have ever been the person in the terminal that a stranger decided did not count. They will decide fast. They will look at you and sort you into a category and dismiss you. And sometimes they will do it loudly, and sometimes there will be no manifest to correct them, no printed page to make them go pale. And you will be tempted, the way I have been tempted 1,000 times, to pull out your ID, to say the sentence, to make them admit what you are. Resist it. That impulse is you asking their permission to matter, and you do not need it. You never did. Do the work so well, they cannot pretend you were not there. Be the person who treats the contractor and the captain exactly the same, because your character is the same whether or not anyone has read your rank. And when the recognition comes, if it ever comes, receive it the way I received that clipboard in the terminal, without gloating and without need, because you will already know what it only just told them. The name at the top of the manifest was never the point. The point is who you are when no one has read it yet. Be that person. The recognition, if it ever arrives, is just the paperwork catching up. If you've ever carried a record no one around you could see and had to decide whether their opinion was even worth correcting, I'd love to hear how you handled it in the comments. Do you think I was right to keep Chief Kilgore on the operation instead of sending him home? Have you ever watched someone actually change once they finally saw the work up close? And what would you have done sitting in that terminal when a stranger told you to go wait with the families? Tell me. I read every comment. If this story meant something to you, hit subscribe and I'll leave you with the same thing my Master Chief left me with. Do the job so well they cannot pretend you were not there.